Hello, friends. Welcome to Literary Concepts. Today's topic is Russian formalism. Now, let us try to understand the basic concept of the Russian formalism. Russian formalism was a literary critical movement that emerged in Russia during 1910s and 1920s. So, it was a Russian formalism was a literary critical movement that was started in Russia. So during 1910s and 1920s. So this Russian formalism focused more on formal aspects of literature, that is related to the form structure instead of personal feelings. So Russian formalism, they focused more on the form and structure of the literature, so that is its structure, language, and techniques, rather than the content, that is the matter or the historical context, the historical backdrop, or the authorial intent, that is the intention of authors. So instead of focusing on these, the matter or the historical backdrop or the author's intention, the Russian formalism more focused on the formal aspects of literature, that is structure, language, and the different techniques which are used in literature. So Russian formalists, they tried to attempt to establish a scientific basis for literary studies. So they attempted to start to establish a scientific basis for literary studies by identifying the literariness, that is the quality that makes writing feel like literature. That is, literariness means the quality that makes writing feel like literature, the literariness of text. So, a scientific basis for literary studies, they wanted to establish it by identifying that literariness of the text, what makes a text work of literature rather than ordinary writing. So if the literariness is there, if that literature kind of feeling is there, so that text is a work of literature instead of just an ordinary writing. So that is the introduction part about Russian formalism. Now let us try to understand the key idea. The main focus of the Russian formalism is literature should be studied as a special use of language. So literature should be focused on the special use of language that is different from everyday language. That is completely different from everyday language through its, okay, through its the form, that is the structures or the shapes which are used, and the devices, that is the techniques which are used in the literature, and the structure, the arrangement of the work. Okay, the arrangement and the organization of the work. Basis on these aspects, we have to study the literature instead of the everyday. Okay, the language is completely different from the ordinary, the everyday language. So this is the key idea of the Russian formalism. Now let us try to understand the historical background of the Russian formalism, the time period of Russian formalism, circa, that is around approximately between 1915 to 1930. So it was emerged during the Russian avant-garde period. So that is avant-garde means the experimental, new and experimental of different ideas in art during that time. Russian avant-garde period, alongside the futurism which focuses on a movement focusing on speed, technology, and future, and constructivism. So constructivism, that was an art movement focusing on construction and usefulness. So the Russian formalism started during these events, which were the Russian avant-garde period, and the futurism and constructivism were also simultaneously. These art movements were also existed. So the prominent centers of Russian formalism were Opazas, Opoyas. See, the Opoyas is a group of Russian scholars. It's a group of Russian scholars who studied literary forms. So the Opoyas is a society for the study of poetic language. So there were these operas in St. Petersburg and the Moscow linguistic circles. These were the prominent centers where that the Russian formalism was developed. Okay, and these prominent centers were suppressed and controlled by Soviet government. Soviet regime means government by 1930s for being politically uncommitted. So they were not strongly supporting the idea. They were not politically committed or the formalist. Understand a person who studies form and structure in literature. So the Russian formalism movement was suppressed by the Soviet government, Russian government by 1930s because of what? They were being politically uncommitted or they were formalist more. So this is the historical background of Russian formalist. The core concepts of Russian formalism. Now let us understand the core concepts which are there in Russian formalism movement. So the first concept is literariness. So in Russia, that is literature nost. Literature nost, it is the word for literariness in Russia is literature nost. So what is this literariness means? That is the quality that makes a text literary. So the literary, a text, okay, the literariness is the quality that makes a text literary. So that found not in content. The literariness is found not in the content, not in the matter which is presented there in the text, but in the formal use of language. But the literariness was there in the formal use of the language, the use of the language. So the literariness concept is the core of the Russian formalistic movement, formalism. And the second concept is defamiliarization. So the defamiliarization, the word astronin is a Russian word for the concept of defamiliarization. Astronin means that is also defamiliarization in Russia. So what is this defamiliarization? Making the familiar things seem strange. Okay, whatever that very known thing that looks strange to disrupt automatic perception, to completely break that automatic understanding and renew our experience of language and objects. So that renews, that resonates our experience of language and objects. That is defamiliarization, that is making something familiar look new and strange to us, making the familiar look strange and renew our experience of language and objects. That is the second concept of Russian formalism. And the third concept is poetic language versus practical language. A poetic language means language used in poetry that is rich in beauty and imagination, whereas practical language means so that is everyday language used for communication that is simple and direct. So poetic language draws attention in Russian formalism. So they have given more attention to the poetic language. So that is to how something is said, how something is said, not just what is said. So here the focus is on how something is narrated, how something is explained, but not what is said there. So that is the more importance is given to poetic language rather than the practical language, the normal language. The fourth concept is device. So the word priyam is used in Russia for the word device. Okay, the devices, literature is composed of literary devices, different literary techniques. So, for example, rhyme, meter, metaphor, and then a syntax. The way the words syntax means the way words are arranged in a sentence. So the metaphor, that is a comparison where one thing is said to be another, a comparison between the two things without using like or as. And then the meter means that is a beat, the rhythm in the poetry, and the rhyme. So the words that have similar ending sounds, rhyme. So all these things are very, very important in Russian formalism. They have given more prominence to literary devices. The study of these devices is central in Russian formalism. Understand? These are the next concept is fabula and sujet. So we have to remember these two words, particularly for net or set examinations or any other competitive examinations. Fabula and sujet. See, fabula means that is the raw chronological events of the story. So in fabula, the basic story in a correct time order. Okay, it is narrated in a chronological, in a proper time order. Understand? That is the basic chronological events of the story. That is what is called fabula. And suicide is the structured artistic presentation of those events, the sequential order of events. Okay, the chronological order of events of a story is fabula. Suicide is the structured artistic presentation. So it is how the story is presented, how the plot is, how it is structured, how it is arranged artistically of those events. That is suicide. These two concepts are also very, very important in Russian formalism. And the next concept is autonomy of literature. So literature is a self-contained system. So it is a complete in itself, not needing outside help. It is a self-sustained system with its own internal rules and history. Literature has its own internal rules and history and should be studied independently. So literature should be studied independently without having the influence of biography, that is the author's uh, feelings, understand the author's background, okay, background or biography, or the politics which were existed during the period, or even the psychology means that is the feelings of the author. So these, okay, the biography means the author's intentions and the author's background and the political influence. We should not focus on these aspects. The literature should be studied independently without focusing on these aspects like biography, politics, or psychology. So that is the autonomy of literature has given more prominence in Russian formalism. And the next last concept is literary evolution. So literary forms evolve as a devices become automatized. So here the literary forms, different forms which evolved, developed as devices, techniques, and become automatized. Automatized, so that is automatically done, and are then replaced by Okay, they are replaced by the new and disruptive forms. Replaced by the new and the disruptive, the unusual styles, the unusual patterns were replaced. Understand? These are the concepts of Russian formalism. Next, the methods and approaches of Russian formalism. Okay, the first method is it is a linguistic analysis. Okay, here this approach bases on linguistic analysis, and by using the linguistic analysis, here we focus on phonetics. Through this approach, we focus on phonetics of the text, the rhythm and syntax, the arrangement of the sentences, the way words are arranged in a sentence, that is syntax, and semantics. So, that is the study of meaning in language. Semantics means the study of meaning in language. So, the first method is a linguistic analysis, so which focuses more on phonetics and rhythm, syntax, and semantics aspects. The second method, the second approach is narrative structure. So, the narrative structure means the way a story is organized, how the plots are organized. Okay, that is fabula and Suiza distinction. So, how the story is organized, focus on more narrative structure. And the third method or the third approach is close reading. So, close reading, that is detailed analysis of text's formal elements. The formal elements like forms, structures, devices, rhyme, meter, metaphors. On these aspects, we have a detailed analysis. And the fourth method or the approach is historical poetics. Historical poetics, that is, in historical poetics, what do? We tracing the development of literary forms. So that is, we just track the development, the origin of the development of the literary forms and techniques over time. How the literary forms and techniques developed over a period of time. So these are the four methods or approaches which we use while applying the formal Russian formalism. And the major figures and their contributions. The major theorists, the first one is Victor Slowsky. Victor Slowsky, he was the person who coined the concept of defamiliarization. So Victor Slowsky, he introduced the concept of defamiliarization, that is astronomy in Russia, and emphasized literary devices as the essence of literature. So Victor Slowsky, he focused more on literary devices as the essence, that is the importance of literature. The next theorist is Roman Jakobson. Roman Jakobson, who developed the ideas of poetic language. So Roman Jakobson, he developed the ideas of poetic language, literary functions, and later contributed to structuralism. Roman Jakobson, he also contributed to structuralism theory. And then the third figure is Boris Eichenbaum. Boris Eichenbaum, he analyzed narrative structures. So he analyzed the narrative structures, that is the role and purpose of events in a story. Narrative structures and formal evolution in literary history. The forms, structures, evolution in literary history. And the next figure is Yuri Tynyanov. Yuri Tynyanov, he proposed the idea of literature as a dynamic system. So that is, it is ever changing, ever developing system. Literature is a ever changing and ever developing system, evolving through internal pressures and literary devices. It was evolving through internal pressures and literary devices. And the next major theorist is Vladimir Prop. Vladimir Prop, in his work Morphology of the Folktale, which was published in 1928, he outlined 31 narrative functions. That is, 31 narrative functions, the roles and purpose of events in a story in Russian folktales, early narratology. So, that is the study of how stories are told and structured. Russian folktales were the early narratology, how the stories are told and structured. So, these are the important theorists of Russian formalism. We have to give more prominence to these concepts. Okay, the defamiliarization, and then okay, 31 narrative functions of Vladimir Prop, Roman Jakobson, Yuri Tanyov. Okay, so all these important theories we have to remember, and their major contributions we have to remember for the sake of the NET or set examination or any other competitive examination. And the important works of Russian formalism. So the first work is Art as Technique, that was published in 1917. So written by Victor Slowsky. So who introduces the defamiliarization as a central function of art. And the second work is Morphology of the Folktale, that was published in 1928. So written by Vladimir Prop. So who discussed structural analysis of folk narratives into 31 functions. So he discussed about the structural analysis of folk narratives into 31 functions. And the third work is on the theory of prose, which was published in 1925. Okay, written by Victor Slowsky, who examines prose techniques and narrative constructions in this. Okay, prose techniques and narrative constructions. And the fourth work is Problems of Dostoevsky's Poetics, so written by Michael Bakhtin. So it was influenced by formalism, but Bakhtin brought in dialogism and sociological elements. Dialogism, that is, dialogism means the idea that many voices or viewpoints exist together in a text. Dialogism means it is an idea that many voices or viewpoints, many views exist together in a text, and sociological elements. These are the important works which are related to Russian formalism. Then the suggested reading. So to understand the Russian formalism more, we can also read Viktor Slowsky's The Theory of Prose, which was published in 1925, Roman Jakobson, Selected Writings, Boris Ekenbaum, How Gogol's Overcoat Was Made, Vladimir Prop, Morphology of Folktale, Peter Steiner, Russian formalism, a metapoetics. So it was a secondary source for deeper understanding of Russian formalism. These are the important works which we can read, and we can understand more about the Russian formalism. So this is all about the Russian formalism theory and movement, literary theory. Okay, so if you find the information is useful, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you so much.